Marcus Blackstone stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd floor office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom he was about to lose. The oil executive who once commanded billion-dollar deals and moved governments, with a single phone call, now faced the unthinkable: complete financial ruin. His empire, built over 3 decades of ruthless drilling and corporate conquest, was crashing down around him faster than he could comprehend. The numbers on his desk painted a grim picture. Blackstone Energy Corporation was hemorrhaging money at an unprecedented rate. Environmental lawsuits had drained his legal reserves. Failed offshore drilling projects had cost him nearly $2 billion. His stock price had plummeted by 87% in just 6 months. Banks were calling in loans. Investors were fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. The man who had once been featured on the cover of Fortune magazine as the king of black gold was now facing bankruptcy proceedings that would strip him of everything he had built. But Marcus Blackstone was not a man who accepted defeat easily. If there was one trait that had carried him from a small-town nobody to the pinnacle of the oil industry, it was his willingness to do whatever it took to survive. And now, with his back against the wall and his legacy hanging by a thread, he had identified his last hope: a sleepy town called Millbrook Valley, population 3,200, sitting on what geological surveys suggested could be the largest untapped oil reserve in North America. The town meant nothing to him. Its people were just obstacles to be removed, compensation checks to be written, environmental concerns to be dismissed. His team of lawyers and lobbyists had already begun the process of eminent domain proceedings. His geologists had confirmed that beneath the quaint Main Street, the local diner, the small farms, and the century-old church, lay enough crude oil to not only save his company, but make him richer than he had ever been. Blackstone had done this before. He had raised entire communities in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. He had turned thriving agricultural lands into industrial wastelands. He had made fortunes by extracting wealth from the earth while leaving environmental disasters in his wake. Millbrook Valley would be no different. In his mind, it was already gone. The plan was simple and brutal. His advance team had already begun buying up properties through shell companies, offering desperate homeowners prices they couldn't refuse during tough economic times. Those who resisted would face legal pressure until they capitulated. The town's small government lacked the resources to fight a corporation of his size. Within 18 months, Millbrook Valley would cease to exist, and in its place would rise the largest oil extraction facility on the continent. Marcus felt no guilt about what he was planning. Sentiment was a luxury he had discarded long ago. His father had been a small-town mechanic who died poor and forgotten. His mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families who looked down on her. He had vowed never to be powerless again, and that vow had shaped every decision of his adult life. If destroying a small town was the price of maintaining his empire, it was a price he was more than willing to pay. But as he stared out at the city lights, Marcus couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The town had been fighting back harder than expected. Environmental groups had rallied to their cause. Local media had picked up the story. There was even talk of federal intervention. His lawyers assured him these were minor setbacks, temporary obstacles that money and influence could overcome. Yet something about Millbrook Valley felt different. Something about this fight felt more dangerous than the corporate battles he had won before. Still, Marcus Blackstone was a man who had never lost a war that mattered. He had crushed union leaders, silenced whistleblowers, and bought politicians like other men bought coffee. One small town would not be his downfall. He would take their land, extract their oil, and rebuild his fortune on the graves of their dreams. It was simply business, and business was the only thing Marcus Blackstone truly understood. The homeless camp beneath the Millbrook Valley overpass was a place most people pretended didn't exist. A collection of makeshift tents and cardboard shelters where society's forgotten gathered to survive another day. It was here, in the most unlikely of places, that Marcus Blackstone's perfectly laid plans would encounter their greatest threat. Thomas Murphy had been living rough for 7 years, ever since a combination of PTSD, bad luck, and a system that failed its veterans had cost him everything he once held dear. The 63-year-old former Army sergeant carried his entire life in a weathered backpack and a shopping cart with a broken wheel. To most people who passed by, he was invisible, just another casualty of a society that discarded those who could no longer contribute to its prosperity. But Thomas Murphy was far more than he appeared to be. Beneath the worn clothes and the grizzled beard was a man who had served his country with distinction, earned a Bronze Star in Vietnam, and returned home to build a life that had once seemed blessed. He had owned property in Millbrook Valley, had raised a family there, had been part of a community that knew his name and valued his contributions. The tragedy that had destroyed Thomas's life had begun 15 years earlier with his wife's cancer diagnosis. Medical bills had consumed their savings. His small construction business had failed during the economic downturn. The stress had driven away his children, who couldn't understand why their father wouldn't accept their help. Pride and shame had isolated him from everyone who might have offered support. When Sarah died, Thomas had simply given up on the idea of rebuilding what had been lost. What Marcus Blackstone didn't know, what no one knew, was that Thomas Murphy still owned the most crucial piece of property in Millbrook Valley. Not the surface rights, which he had been forced to sell years ago, but something far more valuable: the mineral rights to virtually the entire county. It was a legacy from his grandfather, a savvy farmer who had held onto those rights during the Great Depression when everyone else was forced to sell them to survive. The discovery came by accident. Thomas had been sorting through the few possessions he had managed to save from his former life, looking for his military discharge papers to apply for veteran services. Hidden in a folder of old documents was his grandfather's original deed, along with a survey map that showed the full extent of the mineral rights ownership. The papers were yellow with age, the ink faded, but the legal language was clear and unambiguous. Thomas stared at the documents in disbelief. According to these papers, he owned the rights to everything beneath the ground across 12,000 acres of Millbrook Valley. Every drop of oil that Marcus Blackstone planned to extract would require his permission. The homeless veteran that society had thrown away held the key to stopping the most powerful oil executive in America. At first, Thomas couldn't believe it was real. He had been disappointed and betrayed too many times to trust in miracles. He took the documents to a legal aid clinic, where a young lawyer confirmed what seemed impossible. The papers were authentic, properly filed, and legally binding. Thomas Murphy, the homeless man living under a bridge, owned mineral rights worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. But Thomas wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about the families in Millbrook Valley who were about to lose their homes. He was thinking about the children who would grow up without the small-town community that had once embraced him. He was thinking about the environmental destruction that would poison the land where his wife was buried. For the first time in years, Thomas Murphy had a chance to matter again, to stand for something bigger than his own survival. The irony wasn't lost on him. The system that had failed him, the country that had forgotten him, the society that had discarded him, all of it had given him the power to stop Marcus Blackstone. The homeless veteran that people crossed the street to avoid was about to become the most important man in Millbrook Valley. Thomas knew that revealing the truth would change everything. Blackstone's lawyers would descend on him like vultures. The media would turn his life into a spectacle. The simple invisibility that had become his protection would be stripped away forever. But he also knew that some fights were worth having, even when you had nothing left to lose. As Thomas sat in his tent that night, holding his grandfather's deed in his weathered hands, he made a decision that would alter the course of history for an entire town. He would fight Marcus Blackstone with the only weapon he possessed, the truth that no one had bothered to discover about the homeless man they had all chosen to ignore. The news hit Marcus Blackstone's legal team like a lightning bolt on a clear day. A homeless veteran claiming to own mineral rights to their entire drilling operation seemed like the desperate fantasy of a delusional mind. But when their investigation confirmed the authenticity of Thomas Murphy's documents, the oil executive's carefully orchestrated plan began to unravel at terrifying speed. Blackstone's first instinct was to destroy the man who dared to stand in his way. He dispatched his most ruthless lawyers to find legal loopholes, his private investigators to dig up compromising information, and his corporate fixers to make the problem disappear through whatever means necessary. In his world, problems like Thomas Murphy were solved with money, threats, or strategic destruction. He had crushed bigger obstacles than one homeless man. But Thomas Murphy proved to be unlike any opponent Marcus had faced before. The veteran had nothing left to lose, which made him immune to the usual corporate intimidation tactics. When Blackstone's lawyers threatened lawsuits, Thomas pointed out that he couldn't lose what he didn't have. When private investigators tried to dig up dirt on his past, they found only the tragic story of a good man destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. When corporate fixers suggested he might be happier somewhere else, Thomas made it clear he had been living with danger and uncertainty for years. The battle escalated when environmental lawyers caught wind of the story. Suddenly, Thomas Murphy wasn't fighting alone. Legal experts volunteered their services pro bono. Environmental groups provided resources and media support. The story of the homeless veteran taking on the oil giant became a national sensation, turning what should have been a simple business transaction into a David versus Goliath narrative that captured the public's imagination. Blackstone found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts. Stock analysts questioned his company's ability to deliver on promised projects. Environmental regulators launched investigations into his past drilling operations. Congressional representatives called for hearings on eminent domain abuse. What had begun as a private business dispute had mushroomed into a public relations nightmare that threatened to finish what the financial crisis had started. The oil executive's desperation drove him to increasingly extreme measures. He offered Thomas millions of dollars for the mineral rights, then tens of millions, then a percentage of future profits that would have made the homeless man wealthy beyond imagination. But Thomas refused every offer, stating simply that some things weren't for sale. He had seen what Blackstone's drilling operations did to communities and environments. He wouldn't be responsible for bringing that destruction to the place where his wife was buried. As the legal battle intensified, both men's true characters began to emerge under pressure. Marcus Blackstone, stripped of his usual advantages, revealed himself to be a man so consumed by the need for control and dominance that he couldn't conceive of defeat. He raged at his lawyers, threatened his employees, and made increasingly reckless decisions that only strengthened his opponent's position. The polished corporate executive facade cracked to reveal someone who had spent decades bullying his way to success and had never learned how to lose with grace. Thomas Murphy, meanwhile, displayed a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to Blackstone's fury. He gave measured interviews to journalists, attended court hearings in his cleanest clothes, and spoke with the clear moral authority of someone who had lost everything and found something worth fighting for. Veterans groups rallied to his cause. Small-town communities across America saw their own struggles reflected in his story. The homeless man became a symbol of resistance against corporate power run amok. The turning point came when Blackstone made his biggest mistake. Frustrated by months of legal stalemate and mounting financial pressure, he authorized a direct intimidation campaign against Thomas. Corporate security personnel began surveilling the homeless camp. Legal papers were served in the middle of the night. Mysterious accidents began happening to Thomas's few possessions. The tactics that had worked against corporate rivals and small-town governments backfired spectacularly when deployed against someone who had already survived the worst life could throw at him. The intimidation campaign was exposed by an investigative journalist who had been following the story. The revelation that a billionaire oil executive was using corporate resources to harass a homeless veteran created a public relations disaster that no amount of damage control could contain. Stock prices plummeted further. Board members called emergency meetings. Investors demanded explanations for behavior that seemed both morally bankrupt and strategically insane. As the third act of their confrontation reached its climax, Marcus Blackstone found himself facing a choice that would define his legacy. He could continue fighting a battle that was destroying what remained of his reputation and empire, or he could find a way to concede defeat to a homeless man who had outmaneuvered him at every turn. For someone who had never learned how to lose, it was the most difficult decision of his life. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the day that would decide the fate of Millbrook Valley. National media had transformed the legal proceeding into a symbol of America's ongoing struggle between corporate power and individual dignity. Outside, protesters held signs supporting Thomas Murphy, while counter-protesters, funded by Blackstone's remaining allies, argued for economic development and job creation. The entire country seemed to be watching as a homeless veteran and an oil executive faced off in a battle that had grown far beyond its original scope. Marcus Blackstone sat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by a team of lawyers who had cost him more in fees than most people would earn in several lifetimes. But for all their expertise and preparation, they couldn't overcome the fundamental reality that Thomas Murphy's claim to the mineral rights was legally unassailable. The documents were authentic, properly filed, and backed by a chain of ownership that stretched back nearly a century. No amount of legal maneuvering could change the basic facts of the case. As the proceedings unfolded, something unexpected began to happen to Marcus Blackstone. Watching Thomas Murphy testify about his service to his country, his loss of his wife, and his years of homelessness, the oil executive found himself confronting emotions he had spent decades suppressing. Here was a man who had given everything for his country and received nothing in return. Here was someone who had faced genuine tragedy and hardship, not the manufactured crises of corporate boardrooms and stock market fluctuations. For the first time in years, Marcus began to see beyond the narrow lens of profit and loss that had defined his existence. He remembered his own father, the mechanic who had worked honest jobs for honest pay and died without the recognition he deserved. He remembered his mother, who had cleaned houses with dignity even when her employers treated her as invisible. He began to understand that his lifelong war against powerlessness had transformed him into exactly the kind of person who had once made his parents' lives so difficult. The revelation came during Thomas's testimony about why he refused to sell the mineral rights. The homeless veteran spoke about responsibility, not to himself, but to the community that had once embraced him and to the environment that would be destroyed by industrial drilling. He talked about his wife's grave in the Millbrook Valley Cemetery and his promise to protect the place where she rested. He spoke about the children in the town who deserved to grow up in a place that wasn't poisoned by corporate greed. As Thomas spoke, Marcus felt something crack inside him. The armor of cynicism and ruthlessness that had protected him for decades began to crumble. He saw himself as others saw him, a man who destroyed communities for profit, who treated human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business, who had become so obsessed with winning that he had forgotten what victory was supposed to achieve. In that moment of clarity, Marcus Blackstone made a decision that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including himself. He stood up, interrupting his own lawyer's cross-examination of Thomas Murphy, and asked to address the court directly. His legal team tried to stop him, recognizing the potential for disaster. But Marcus had moved beyond concern for legal strategy or corporate damage control. What followed was the most honest speech Marcus Blackstone had ever given in his life. He acknowledged that Thomas Murphy was the rightful owner of the mineral rights. He admitted that his company's tactics had been heavy-handed and inappropriate. He spoke about his own journey from poverty to power and how that journey had cost him his connection to the values his parents had tried to instill in him. But Marcus went further than simple acknowledgement of defeat. He announced that Blackstone Energy Corporation was withdrawing all claims to drilling rights in Millbrook Valley. More than that, he was establishing a foundation dedicated to supporting homeless veterans, with Thomas Murphy as its first board member and primary beneficiary. The oil executive who had built his fortune by taking from communities announced his intention to spend his remaining wealth giving back to them. The transformation was so unexpected that many observers initially dismissed it as a calculated public relations move. But as Marcus continued speaking, it became clear that something genuine was happening. He wasn't trying to save his reputation or minimize his losses. He was attempting to salvage something more important: his humanity. Thomas Murphy's response was equally surprising. Instead of claiming victory over his defeated opponent, The homeless veteran extended his hand to Marcus Blackstone and spoke about forgiveness and second chances. He acknowledged that everyone deserved the opportunity to change, regardless of their past mistakes. The gesture of reconciliation between the two men became an iconic moment that transcended the specific legal dispute and spoke to broader possibilities for healing and redemption. The courtroom erupted in chaos as journalists rushed to file their stories and spectators tried to process what they had witnessed. The legal case that had captivated the nation had ended not with a bitter victory for one side, but with an unexpected alliance between former enemies. Marcus Blackstone and Thomas Murphy, the oil executive and the homeless veteran, had found common ground in their shared recognition that some things mattered more than winning or losing. 6 months after the courtroom confrontation that changed both their lives, Marcus Blackstone and Thomas Murphy stood together on the main street of Millbrook Valley, watching as the town celebrated its annual harvest festival. The community that had once faced destruction was now thriving in ways that neither man could have imagined when their battle began. The transformation had been remarkable. Marcus's foundation had not only provided Thomas with housing and medical care, but had funded a comprehensive homeless veterans program that was being replicated in cities across America. The oil executive's personal involvement in the foundation's work had surprised skeptics who had dismissed his courtroom conversion as performance art. But Marcus had proven his sincerity through consistent action, spending his time and remaining resources on causes that generated no profit and provided no strategic advantage. Thomas Murphy had become an unlikely celebrity, but he had used his newfound fame to advocate for veterans' rights and homelessness prevention. His story had inspired legislation providing better support for military personnel transitioning to civilian life. The homeless man who had once been invisible had become one of the most powerful voices in America for society's forgotten citizens. Millbrook Valley itself had been preserved not just from industrial development, but elevated as a model for sustainable small-town life. Environmental groups had established a research center there, studying ways to balance economic development with ecological protection. The town that Marcus had once planned to destroy had become a symbol of hope for communities facing similar threats from corporate expansion. The relationship between the two former adversaries had evolved into something resembling friendship. Marcus had discovered that Thomas possessed the kind of wisdom that couldn't be learned in business schools or corporate boardrooms. The veteran's perspective on life, shaped by both service and suffering, had helped Marcus understand that true success couldn't be measured in stock prices or quarterly profits. Thomas, meanwhile, had found in Marcus a reminder that people could change, that even the most seemingly irredeemable individuals could choose a different path. Their collaboration had extended beyond the foundation to include business ventures that prioritized social impact over profit maximization. They had invested in renewable energy projects that provided jobs for veterans, affordable housing developments that prevented homelessness, and educational programs that taught corporate responsibility alongside business strategy. The oil executive who had once embodied ruthless capitalism had become an advocate for conscious commerce that considered human and environmental costs alongside financial returns. The broader impact of their story had resonated far beyond Millbrook Valley. Corporate executives across America had been forced to confront questions about their own values and priorities. Business schools had added case studies examining the ethical dimensions of profit-seeking behavior. The story of Marcus Blackstone and Thomas Murphy had become a parable for an age struggling to balance individual success with collective responsibility. But perhaps the most significant change had been in the two men themselves. Marcus had discovered that the respect and fulfillment he had spent his life seeking couldn't be bought or conquered, but only earned through service to something larger than himself. He had learned that true power came not from the ability to control others, but from the strength to control one's own choices and impulses. Thomas had found that his years of homelessness and hardship hadn't been meaningless suffering, but preparation for a role he couldn't have imagined. His experience of powerlessness had taught him empathy for others facing similar struggles. His survival skills had given him resilience that proved invaluable when confronting corporate intimidation. His military training had prepared him for battles that had nothing to do with combat, but everything to do with courage. As the harvest festival continued around them, both men reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. A year earlier, they had been enemies locked in a battle that seemed to represent everything wrong with American society. The powerful crushing the powerless, corporate greed destroying communities, individual success coming at the expense of collective welfare. Now they stood as partners in efforts to heal some of the damage that systems like those had caused. The story of their transformation had become a source of hope for people who had lost faith in the possibility of change. It demonstrated that redemption was possible even for those who seemed beyond saving, that common ground could be found even between the most unlikely allies, and that individual choices could still make a difference in a world that often seemed driven by impersonal forces beyond anyone's control. Their legacy would extend far beyond the specific legal battle that had brought them together. They had shown that economic systems could be reformed, that corporate power could be redirected toward social good, and that the most marginalized members of society might hold keys to solutions that the most powerful couldn't imagine. The oil executive and the homeless veteran had become symbols of a different kind of American dream, one that measured success not by what individuals could accumulate for themselves, but by what they could contribute to others. As the sun set over Millbrook Valley, Marcus Blackstone and Thomas Murphy knew that their work was far from finished. There were more veterans to help, more communities to protect, and more minds to change about what business and success should really mean. But they also knew that they had proven something important, that it's never too late to choose a different path, never too late to stand for something better, and never too late to discover that the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be bought, sold, or extracted from the ground. The story of Marcus Blackstone and Thomas Murphy reminds us that the most powerful force in the world isn't money, influence, or corporate might. It's the courage of ordinary people to stand up for what's right, even when they have everything to lose and nothing to gain. What would you do if you found yourself in Thomas Murphy's position? Would you take the money and run, or would you fight for something bigger than yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this incredible true story. If this story inspired you or made you think differently about power, success, and what really matters in life, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to The Human Tapestry for more stories that reveal the extraordinary courage and dignity hiding in the most unexpected places. Together, we can shine a light on the heroes walking among us every single day.